I will have to improvise a bit. I will sort of talk you through some of my materials and try to emphasize a few points that seem important to me and that seem potential material for a discussion to me. So maybe this improvisational approach can actually stimulate the discussion. As a great Dutch dialectical thinker once said, elk nadeel heeft zijn voordeel. So maybe this is the voordeel of the nadeel of my cold. Anyway, some remarks on symptoms. I was struck in the context of the recent discourse, if you can call it that, surrounding knowledge production and artistic research, etc. I was struck by some artistic approaches to symptoms or some artistic uses of symptoms. Well, this isn't recent, as you can see. I would sort of my basic point of departure is a distinction between two different regimes of the symptom, if you will, or two forms of two different approaches to the symptom. One, let's say, modern; the other, contemporary. The modern approach I would want to characterize in a very general manner as the attempt to liberate the symptom, the attempt to liberate the symptom from a strictly clinical or analytical context, and to embrace the symptom as a potent and unique form of expression that can be opposed to, let's say, a normal, regular cultural production. The sort of crucial image I don't have, unfortunately, but in 1928 Louis Aragon and André Breton published a kind of homage to hysteria in La Révolution Surréaliste, and they published a few images like the one you see on the left from the iconographie photographique de la Salpêtrière, attitude passionnelle. So this is actually from the iconographie photographique de la Salpêtrière, but this and I think actually this specific image and a few like it were published in 28 by Breton and Aragon, and they completely left away all the sort of nasty and difficult and not too not too positive clinical aspects. Left away all the suffering of these women at this clinic in Paris. They left away all the basically the whole clinical side to it, the whole pathological side, and they celebrated hysteria as a unique form of expression, as a unique form of theater, if you will, or a form of visual production. So these attitudes passionnelles became expressive attitudes, devoid of all the concerns that the doctors at the Salpêtrière had about how to cure these women, or how to reduce the symptoms, at least. That wasn't Breton and Aragon's approach at all. So we see that the symptom, in this case very serious hysterical symptoms, are discovered by artists and embraced as an alternative form of expression, and as an alternative sign, maybe. But the status of the symptom is difficult precisely insofar as the symptom is not really a sign, or it isn't a complete sign. It is kind of a proto-sign. It could be turned into a sign if it is interpreted in the correct manner. That's the official discourse, if you will. That's the discourse by Charcot or the discourse by Freud. The symptom has to be interpreted and turned into a sign that can be read. It has to be made readable, if you will. The surrealists, but also other modern artists, go in the opposite direction, as it were. they do think that the symptom is sign-like in some respects, in that it is expressive and it has certain a certain meaning in this way, but it is not a meaning that can easily be pinpointed and put into words. That is precisely the value given to the symptom. On the right, you see some later works from the late 60s, early 70s by Arnold Reiner. And Reiner is a later artist who, in his way, also appropriates symptoms, as it were. He was stimulated, among other things, by the sculptures by the 18th century artist Franz Xaver Messerschmidt, who was who was a well-known sort of psychiatric case, and Reiner too appropriates symptoms and uses them as expressive quasi-science or anti-science even. So something that can be opposed to, let's say, mass culture, to put it simplistically. As I said, medics, psychiatrists, psychologists constantly try to turn the symptom into a sign, and that's precisely what many modern artists, but also someone like Georges Didi Uberman, who wrote a famous book, of course, on the invention of hysteria, in which he analyzes this theatrical culture and photographic culture of the Salpêtrière, in which these women are constantly photographed. Georges Didi Uberman too criticizes this tendency to make the symptom readable, to integrate it into a more classical visual regime, to integrate the symptom into tableaus and to make them in this way readable. And if I can just and just go back for a minute. The one on the left, you see the famous hysteria patient Augustine, and her attitudes, her postures were so classical that they were used over and over again to illustrate the different phases of hysteria according to Charcot's model. So this represents a particular phase in the progress of the disease, in the progress of an attack, and there were others like that, or well, not quite like that, of course, different poses, different attitudes, and in this way hysteria and its symptoms were made readable. But even this is from the 1870s, but even in the later 1880s and in the 1890s, this became slightly problematic, this tendency to turn hysteric symptoms into really quite classical and static poses, because of advances in photography. In the 1870s, it was really a necessity to photograph women in somewhat calm condition, because if they moved too much, the exposure time would be too long and you wouldn't really see a clear image. So there was a necessity to photograph them whilst they were in slightly or somewhat static poses. Well, in the later 1880s, early 1890s, Albert Londe, in particular at the Salpêtrière, worked on reducing shutter speed, and he also devised this camera with multiple lenses, and with this camera he could photograph sequences of different moments from a movement, somewhat like Muybridge did in the United States, even though the technology was different and the results looked quite different. This also raises the question, well, where does it stop? If the camera eye becomes more discerning than the human eye, does it actually lead to improvements in our knowledge, or does it just lead to an accumulation of data that we can make sense of? So this whole Charcot regime, in which phases have to be isolated, and in which different phases and different phases in the development of the hysterical symptoms have to be made legible, readable. this whole approach becomes difficult to sustain if we can make random photographs of a movement and they're all sort of in principle equal. Then where is our classical system left? Where is our classical tabulation left? What becomes of that if we are confronted with this optical unconscious, to use Benjamin's term, Walter Benjamin's notion of the optical unconsciousness, of the optical unconscious was of course shaped by these technical advances, by instant photography and by film later. On the left you see some hands from classical Renaissance paintings as isolated by Giovanni Morelli in the late 19th century. And Morelli was of course Morelli was an art historian who was instrumental in shaping Freud's notion of the symptom. Freud noted that Morelli had paid close attention to inadvertent, unconscious traits in works of art. So artist A, like Fra Filippo Lippi, always paints hands in the same manner, but he doesn't realize that it's not conscious, it's like an unconscious symptom. So in this way, Freud was really stimulated to develop his psychoanalytical symptomatology. This is just an aside, but to return to the question of the optical unconscious, it is quite interesting to me that Jeff Wall's works contain many strange, small, symptomatic gestures, or gestures that don't seem to make a lot of sense in terms of normal, accepted, everyday behavior. They are strange, and as such they almost demand to be read as symptoms of something else, of some mental imbalance, perhaps. This is a famous example, of course, from the 1980s, Milk, in which a man apparently squeezes this milk carton in a really strange, spasmodic way. Otherwise, the explosion of milk would not be really explicable. And of course, here we also see the camera eye being rather more discerning and quicker than the human eye in freezing this moment. But with Wall, as I said, these kind of gestures, these small events, these small occurrences, they almost demand to be read, or to be read. They demand to be read as symptoms, and yet it never quite congeals into something as clear cut as, let's say, a photographic image that Charcot would be pleased with. It never turns into a really classical face that we can pinpoint and frame in the manner that Charcot tried to frame his patients, as it were, in his visual regime at Salpêtrière. So there always remains something uncomfortable and tentative about our interpretations of these works. So we can read these kind of gestures or moments in Jeff Wall's work as symptoms of maybe a mental imbalance in the character. We can also read them maybe as social symptoms, and maybe this is some kind of one who is a victim of society, and we can read this in terms of kind of a social symptomatology. But these things are tentative. So on the one hand, we do see that there is a difference here, and that's an important point, a difference with this modern appropriation of the symptom, which is a liberation of the symptom as an expressive means, as an expressive form, as a kind of an anti-sign. Here we see that there are indications that the symptoms can be read and hence turned into signs, as it were. So these explosions, as Didi Uberman called symptoms, these explosions in the world of meaning, in the realm of science, are, as it were, tentatively turned back into science, into something that we can read. But it is a matter of suggestion. These are simulated symptoms, and they both challenge us and challenge us to identify them and to read them, and they frustrate our attempts to do so. This is another example, Rifle, a much more recent work in which a man apparently, for no reason at all and out of nowhere, mimes the gesture of shooting a gun on the street. a similar case. I will give some other examples of artists that to me encapsulate the sort of specificity of contemporary symptom simulation, if you will, in art. So after the regime of symptom liberation, I would say this is the regime of artistic symptomatology. So artists create works that suggest a symptomatological reading of gestures or even speech acts. We will come to that later. They suggest that these things can be read, that these symptoms are readable, that these symptoms are on the verge of becoming readable signs, but things are never quite clear cut. I'll come to that later too. This is work by the Dutch artist Berend Strik and one architectural firm, a design for a house for two sisters who suffer from Tourette's syndrome. Gilles de la Tourette was, of course, one of the people working at the Salpêtrière Hospital. He collaborated on this photographic iconography, and he identified the syndrome that was named after him, Tourette's syndrome, in which people, among other things, cannot really control their language, their utterances, and they shout all kinds of abuse without being able to control it. That's one of the symptoms. This is a house designed for two American sisters who are constantly forced to move because of these symptoms. So Strik and one architecture designed a house for them that would kind of cater to their individual needs. It would be really resistant with kind of really tough materials, but also materials that they can kind of bump into without hurting themselves too much. It would also kind of separate them because they would always argue, but then there would be a central space, the one you see on the right, and the central space is kind of the neutral meeting ground, also called the punch bowl. Anyway, this work is pretty unique, I think, in contemporary art, insofar as it really addresses in a very serious way these pathological symptoms belonging to this syndrome. And well, it isn't too surprising, of course, that it hasn't been built yet. So the design process was quite extended, and there was a lot of research was done, but of course, who will fork the money for something like this? You would have to find some kind of donor or some kind of sponsor, and so far that hasn't happened. So in this way, this work also, even though it has a pretty unique status, I would say, also is part of this symptomatology in contemporary art, insofar as the fact that it hasn't been built and maybe cannot be built is rather symptomatic of sort of the conditions for architecture and sort of social projects in contemporary culture. To go back in time a bit, a work many of you know probably, maybe some of you have even seen it here, Martha Rosler's The Semiotics of the Kitchen in 1975, a work in which Rosler mentions the names of various kitchen utensils in alphabetical order, and that makes gestures to demonstrate the object in question, but the gestures are really strange and halting and mechanical and frantic. So in this way, the video suggests that the kitchen is a place of an institution, as it were, in which symbolic violence is done to women, to housewives. So this cooking demonstration turns into a symptomological exercise. So far I focused on gestures like Jack Wolf's gestures or Martha Rosler's frantic stabbings when demonstrating her knives and ice picks, etc. Another realm of the symptom that was also particularly important to Freud is, let's say, symptoms in language, like various Fehlleistungen, various slips, the proverbial Freudian slips. These are not necessarily as serious, of course, as proper neurotic or hysterical or paranoid symptoms. In the case of Tourette's syndrome, they are quite serious, obviously, but everyday normal Freudian slips are a somewhat more light-hearted affair, if you will, and yet they too can be put to use for contemporary arts symptomatology. I'm thinking in particular of Andrea Fraser's works, various performances in which there is a constant slippage of language, in which she, as it were, inhabits a certain character or inhabits a certain discourse, but the discourse is never stable. There are constantly different voices that blend into each other and follow up on each other, and in this way she engages in a kind of ideology critique, you might say, a symptomological form of ideology critique. In Fraser's work, there are also more physical symptoms, you might say. This is from the video Little Frank and His Carp, in which she listens to an audio guide at the Guggenheim Bilbao, and the audio guide waxes on lyrically about the fantastic curving volumes created by the brilliant master architect Frank Gehry, and this character Fraser is playing here is apparently so easily influenced by this audio guide voice that she starts humping these walls, because it's such a great sensuous experience. So, well, you could see the looks of the other people. This is not exactly normal behavior, and again, you could see this as part of an artistic symptomatology in which the kind of ideological interpellation of the visitor by the museum is made explicit through these acts. To return to language and to Freudian slips, to put it in simple terms, another artist interesting and important in this respect, I would say, is Omer Fast. Particularly works like CNN Concatenated and Godville. Those are works in which Fast recuts monologues, recuts the words of either newsreaders on CNN, in the case of CNN Concatenated, or monologues by living history interpreters. Living history interpreters are kind of costume guides at this historical theme park called Colonial Williamsburg, in which it's the late 18th century is reenacted every day. People can visit and they can be guided by these people in costumes, and they pretend to be actual 18th century people for the complete experience. And Omer Fast has kind of interviewed them, and in their recut, reassembled monologues, there's a constant slippage between sort of the 21st century and the 18th century. One is often not quite sure whether the person is talking in character or as his actual early 20th century self. I'll sort of give you one short example. The man you see there on the left, for instance, Jack, who is a militiaman. I will just read you part of his monologue. And you have to understand that we're not really trying to inflict our will on the people. It's basically just trying to get the impediment to the people's will under control by attacking soldiers, military targets, but also things like government employees and newspapers and political correctness and affirmative action and government taxes and popular culture and schools and hospitals and movies And with the internet, it makes it even easier, you know, locking up entire villages and churches and setting them on fire, you know, blowing theme parks and hotels and tourists. So it becomes this absolutely insane monologue, which again strongly suggests a symptomological reading. So it suggests that this is kind of like the hidden voice, hidden thoughts or proto-thoughts made explicit in staged, simulated slips. So basically the whole monologue is one endless sequence of uncontrolled language, symptomatic language. Another example is a black man called Will, who acts the role of the part of a slave in colonial Williamsburg, and his monologue ends in a really quite long rant on God, of which these are just a few sentences. God is the performance without someone to present it. God is not knowing the facts. God is perhaps the lack of knowledge. God is something, that four-letter word. God is white. God is working class. God is American. God is taking over. God got beaten all the time. So, well, God is perhaps a lack of knowledge, as Will says, but these works constantly play with the lack of knowledge that is a symptom. A symptom is perhaps, in its most simple definition, a lack of knowledge manifested physically or verbally. Something, some little explosion, a physical or verbal explosion that is not quite a sign, but that people, interpreters, psychoanalysts, doctors constantly try to turn into signs that can be read. To some extent, contemporary art goes along with this tendency, making the symptom readable, making the symptom into something that suggests a symptomological reading, often in social terms or political terms, certain gestures, certain speech acts that suggest that we are witnessing some kind of repressed social or political unconscious. So in this way, contemporary art goes along with the tendency to colonize the symptom, to turn the symptom into a sign. But on the other hand, I would say that a certain dubiousness is always part of the game. These are staged symptoms that flaunt their own status as simulations, and they flaunt their own questionable character. So they inhabit this uneasy point on the border of symptom and sign, and I think this is a particularly interesting position in today's culture of artistic research and knowledge production, etc. I think this is quite an interesting way of questioning a certain logocentrism, a certain kind of technocratic logocentrism that creeps into a lot of discourse. So, well, that's the main reason, I guess, why I wanted to investigate this contemporary form of symptom production or symptom simulation, rather, for this project. Well, this was my Kleistian improvisation. I hope I managed to get some points across that make you think. And, well, that's it for the moment. I forgot one image. This is part of the script of Godville, in which Omer Fast shows the final text, that's the big typeface, and then some parts of the original sentences are given in the smaller lines under the main lines. So there one can kind of see where he branched off and constructed completely different symptomatic sentences out of his raw material.